this week and I was like, what do I really want to hone in on that I haven't yet discussed with my audience? And I went back to, and I think you spoke about this with Max on his show, which is
Yeah.
where I first heard of you, but the whole concept of inflammation,
Yeah.
right? It's a term that's thrown around so much, oftentimes, I mean, not very accurately. So I wanted to create an episode just on this topic, bust some myths, get the lowdown, and, just kind of share what is actual truth versus, again, what we hear a lot of people throw out in the wellness space nowadays.
Sure. Cool.
Awesome. Yeah. So with that, let's just start with the basics. Let's go first grade level. Can you explain what inflammation is?
Yeah, it's a great question. In its most simplest form, inflammation is signaling. It's basically your body signaling to the immune system, other components of the body, hey, like something is happening here, whether it's, damage or the encounter of, a foreign pathogen, an invader, a bacteria, a virus, something else. You get a splinter, right? Like wood shouldn't be in the skin. So your body sends an inflammation signal that allows your immune system to respond. So at the very minimum, inflammation is signaling. And I tell this to every patient we have with Monarch, like the goal is not eliminating inflammation. Having zero inflammation is not the goal. The goal is to minimize the amount of inflammation that we're exposed to over the course of our life. Because with every benefit of the inflammatory process, there are also potential maladies, negative impacts that can occur from sustained high levels of inflammation for a long period of time. The most common are, it can impact your arteries and veins. It can cause hardening or calcification of those structures. Where we need them to be flexible, they can become, fixed and solid if they're exposed to too much inflammation for too long of a period of time. And then the other part is, primarily impact on nerve structures. So high levels of inflammation can impact nerve conductivity and function, which you see commonly in people that are diabetic, pre-diabetic. They start to get numbness in their fingers and toes. They start to lose sensation. It can impact their ocular function, their vision. So, big picture, inflammation is signaling we need it. We just don't want too much for too long. It should absolutely be intermittent and purely in a response to something that our body needs to, protect itself from or repair.
Right. Absolutely. And again, alluding back to this term, chronic inflammation, right? Some folks say chronic inflammation is the root of all disease. Would you agree with that?
Yes. So I think it's more nuanced. And I think what they're trying to say with that is chronic high levels of inflammation. Because again, we always have some sort of inflammation in our system. So technically, if you said chronic inflammation, like if you're generally healthy, you still have a little bit of inflammation. So I think when you say chronic inflammation, what people need to understand is chronic high levels of inflammation sustained over a long period of time.
Right. And here's a question for you. So unless someone really goes to a functional or integrative practitioner, oftentimes the regular conventional doctor is not going to throw in a CRP blood test in a regular panel. So what are some of like the warning signs of excess inflammation that people should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the simple ones that pretty much everyone is going to get as long as they go get a physical done every year is hemoglobin A1C. So your hemoglobin A1C is your diabetes risk metric, crudely. So basically, what's your average blood sugar over the last 3 months? It's measuring the percentage of red blood cells bound by a sugar molecule. So if you have higher blood sugar, less sensitivity to insulin, decreased insulin function, your A1C, your blood sugar percentage is going to go up. And that can be a metric of, pre-diabetes, diabetes, metabolic disease. If your A1C is high, meaning greater than 5.7, you probably have high levels of inflammation because, whether that's causing your blood sugar to go up or your elevated blood sugar is, sugar in excess is toxic to the body. Like that's another great metric to look and try to understand, like, how much inflammation is probably present in my body, because I've very rarely seen people with borderline or above, pre-diabetic range that don't have other high markers of inflammation such as CRP or SED rate. So
Yeah.
even if you're not going to a functional medicine practitioner or integrative medical practitioner, pretty much every primary care specialist will do a hemoglobin A1C. And like if you're 5.7 or above, if you're considered pre-diabetic or worse, like you probably have higher levels of inflammation in your system purely based on blood sugar control and insulin sensitivity.
Interesting. I had some blood work done not too long ago. My hemoglobin A1C was like 5.6, I think, so relatively good, but my CRP was slightly elevated. So, and I know CRP, I mean, it can increase if you have sunburn, right? Or if you
Sure.
exercise a lot the previous day. So,
Totally.
with that, I mean, does one necessarily like correlate to the other or not as much?
Kind of, but like CRP is a lot more acute in terms
Acute.
of what it's measuring. Yeah. So like
Yeah.
it's difficult to say, but if you consistently get your blood work done and you have a CRP that's, you know, it kind of depends on who you're talking to, but if it's higher than 3, it's definitely too high. Some people say higher than 1 is too high. I try to keep our people less than 1.0, but
Mm-hmm.
if it's consistently elevated and your A1C is consistently elevated, like they are probably synergistically not helping you in terms of, potential health outcomes.
Right.
Um, but again, like it's very day to day dependent. If you didn't get good sleep the night before, your CRP may be elevated. If you just got off an illness, you're coming off the back end, or maybe it's starting, CRP is going to be
Right.
high. Hard workout, CRP is going to be high. There's
Yep.
all sorts of different things. Um, and back to your previous question, because I realized that I didn't fully answer it. Other signs and symptoms: swelling, chronic pain, brain fog, low energy, low libido, potentially depression. Those are all things, body weight retention, like difficulty losing body fat. Like those are all things that could potentially be associated with higher levels of inflammation.
Mm.
If you think as a woman, like the menstrual period is an inflammatory period as those things are changing in your body. What happens during those periods of time? You're bloated, you're swollen, you're irritable, your mood changes. Like a lot of that is hormones, but there's also a contributing factor from the inflammation as well. So those are some simple
Right.
things to think about. I find one of the most common ones, to be honest, is people with like when your inflammation levels are high, your pain threshold is lower. Your
Low.
nerves are more sensitive. So when
Yeah.
people are super stressed, they have a lot of inflammation, they're sick, like everything hurts, everything bothers you.
Yeah.
And then once you get over it, like you're not as sensitive to those things. So I tend to find people who, for whatever reason, have like higher levels of daily pain, achiness, soreness, whatever, and they don't necessarily like know what caused it specifically. It's pretty generalized. Those people
Yeah.
tend to have higher levels of baseline inflammation as well.
Right. And for those people, I mean, what do you identify as some of the main causes of inflammation? I mean, that's a loaded question, right? There's so many
Yeah,
things, but
seriously.
from what you've seen, like what are the most common?
Yeah. So, man, I would say lack of sleep, alcohol intake, poor diet or nutrition, um, dehydration, not drinking enough water. Those are probably the most common. So it's
Hmm.
basically like, sleep, hydration, nutrition, movement, not moving enough. One of the best things that you can do to control blood sugar is lift weights, resistance train. So I think, people that aren't exercising tend to have higher levels of inflammation, but for the most part, the simple ones are people that don't sleep well, they drink too much alcohol, they have a poor diet, they're not drinking water. Those are the big ones. I do see a lot of people that exercise too much, which can also actually cause inflammation, because if you're overdoing it,
Yeah.
you're constantly damaging muscle, you're not allowing your body to appropriately recover. I tend to see higher levels of, inflammation or inflammation related issues in those people as well. So you can do too much of a good thing.
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask you that. You're going to think I'm crazy, but here in Greenville, South Carolina, we have some incredible trails, and I am always walking. Walking is like my
Mm,
stress outlet, such
nice.
that I think I average around like 25,000 steps a day.
Wow.
And
Good
yeah,
for
and
you.
and my body's used to it because I do it every day, right? But I mean, could that lend to an increased CRP level, or like at some point does your body adjust?
The human body is super resilient and super adaptable. So like walking 25,000 steps a day, probably was the norm for us hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago when we
Right.
were hunters and gatherers, right? So as long as like, you're not noticing chronic fatigue, you're not noticing your ankles, knees, hips are, chronically sore or, painful, swollen, things like that. And your energy levels are pretty good. Like we have the ability to adapt and we should be moving, all throughout the day. So I don't think there's a threshold. There's a number of steps. I think, allow your body to be the guide. Like if you notice like, hey, I'm sore, I'm tired, I'm achy, I'm not sleeping well, I'm generally irritable, like then yeah, you may be pushing it too hard. And there may be days where you're just like, I need a rest day today. Like today, I'm not going to hit that number or I'm not going to be as active. Those things are totally fine. Like allow your body to kind of guide you in terms of what you're doing. But um, I mean, there's even been studies looking at like the 10,000 steps a day. Like, is that actually accurate? Like people that hit 10,000 steps, do they have more significant beneficial health outcomes? And like, those pieces of data are somewhat mixed. So I don't know if there's a number, but like moving your body is never a bad thing. That being
Right.
said, if you're going to be super active, you need to make sure you're getting good sleep and you're drinking enough water to replenish fluid loss. You need
Yeah.
to make sure you're getting enough calories and protein to help fuel your body so you don't contribute, and don't slide into a state of, muscle breakdown versus muscle repair. So
Yeah.
um, I will never stop someone from moving as long as it's not, specific, like causing them immediate harm. Um, or also like, we get people here that are, in the club for 3 to 4 hours a day. And like at a certain point, me telling them, I think you're exercising too much probably is not going to work. But me showing them their biologic data, which is like, hey man, you've had, or male or female, like your inflammation levels are high, your hormone levels are starting to decline, your
Yeah.
mood state's shifting. Like there's a lot of other things that can be associated with that, higher stress, prolonged exposure experience. So
Yeah.
usually I let the numbers and the data, support me in why I'm trying to explain something. Otherwise, they just feel like
Yeah.
you're you're forcing your opinion on them, and they're just like,
Yep.
well, I've been doing this forever, and like I'm still doing okay. I'm like, kind of, but look at your blood
Yeah.
work, or look at your body composition, whatever. So,
Yeah. Human
yeah,
nature. That
being
makes sense.
being being armed with data, typically helps. And if you can show someone, and which is why we do what we do here with Monarch, and have the medical and the physical therapy and the nutrition, and we're collecting objective data, like if they still refuse to change their behavior, like we've done everything that we can do, and potentially there needs to be a intervention of another source, whether it's a health issue or something
Right.
else that really like shocks them back into uh, better alignment.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Again, I'm super excited for you to open up that one in Miami because I love the approach. I love everything you're doing. But I'll be sharing more
Thank you.
about that later. But I'm going
Cool.
back to diet. I am curious, what are some of the most like common dietary triggers of inflammation? So you mentioned
Oh
alcohol.
God.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, this could be a whole episode in itself, but
Totally.
I mean, refined carbs, like seed oils, like again, all these terms thrown out. What are the worst ones? What
Tons,
should we avoid?
man. Well, anything that's not natural. So if you're looking at preservatives, artificial flavors, colors, the seed oils is an interesting one because like, I think that's relatively recent in terms of the introduction into our diet. So we're still trying to figure out like what's doing what there. But for the most
Yeah.
part, seed oils tend to be problematic for people. Um, you know, high sugar diet, high glycemic diet, so refined grains, processed foods, ultra processed foods, which typically have some of those other things we talked about, preservatives, colorings, flavorings, things that are not natural. Um, Alcohol in itself, is like, it's kind of a nuanced response because yes, it's a simple sugar. It causes us, to be inebriated if we consume in too great a volume. I think the bigger thing from an inflammation standpoint is it impacts our sleep.
Sleep.
It causes us to be dehydrated. So it's like the subsequent effect secondary to the alcohol consumption. Perhaps we're going to start eating things late at night that we wouldn't typically eat because of, whatever poor decision making that we follow. So it's not like the alcohol in itself. It's typically the other things that are associated with that behavior, which are disrupted sleep, poor diet
Yeah.
choices, dehydration, which is inevitable with alcohol because alcohol is a diuretic. So, I mean, I am not a strong supporter of alcohol intake. I think the overwhelming data is like, if you can avoid it, avoid it.
Yeah.
But if you're going to do it, like, you need to ensure you're making other appropriate lifestyle decisions to allow your ability to tolerate that. Gluten and dairy, like,
Yeah.
super
What are your thoughts on
inflammatory.
these?
I mean, if we were in Europe and our agricultural and nutritional practices were regulated more consistently, like the European model, probably wouldn't have a huge issue with it. I have a lot of patients that are gluten sensitive, lactose sensitive. They go to Europe for a couple of weeks. It's very common in LA. People disappear for a month in the summer and the winter. They have no
Yeah.
problems. They eat all the pasta. They have all the cheese, whatever, no issue. So there's something not only about gluten and dairy, but there's also something about how we have cultivated them agriculturally here. And there's, if you've been paying attention, you shop at places like Whole Foods, excuse me, and others, like, there's this rise of popularity and it's called A2 milk. I don't know if you've heard
Mm-hmm.
about that, but like
Yep.
casein, which is the milk protein, there's two primary subtypes, A1 and A2. A1 tends to be more inflammatory. That's seemingly the subtype that's more common in the cows that we have in the United States. A2
Yeah.
is more common in Europe. So something's happened chemically from a conformation standpoint of the casein, the milk protein. Um, so in the US, it's like the high concentration of gluten in our foods. Dairy tends to be a little bit problematic. Beans and legumes, an interesting one. Like, there's a book called The Plant Paradox, which I
Mm-hmm.
forget who wrote it, but um, their premise is we weren't meant to eat beans and legumes. They have natural defense mechanisms that tend to cause us to have, GI issues, GI response, and immune system response. I've found that I do pretty well with beans. I love hummus, but other people don't. And so, like, those are probably the big areas that I try first for people if they're struggling GI, situations, inflammation situations. It's like, all right, let's look at our diet. Can we cut out ultra processed foods? Can we minimize gluten and dairy, or ideally eliminate it? Can we decrease our alcohol intake because of the multitude of things that it impacts, including our gut microbiome and decreasing the diversity, because alcohol can basically kill a lot of gut bacteria. So those are the big ones, as well as anything that's non-natural, preserved, artificial. Seed oils, I'm still playing around with, but the other
Yeah.
ones are pretty common. And the other ones are massive staples of most people's diet. So, like, one of the phrases I say quite often is common things are common. So if we can eliminate the common things, let's see how we do there before we start, seeking out the needle in the haystack, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Going back to gluten. So again, I mean,
Yeah.
so many different opinions on this. Some people are like, just avoid gluten completely. Some people are like, if you don't have a gluten intolerance or celiac, like, you can have it. I've heard that gluten in the US, as you said earlier, it's binary. It's not pure gluten, and that's why when folks go to Europe, they don't have any issues.
Yeah.
Has there been
Yeah.
any actual research on that? Because then I've also heard some people say, well, when people go to Europe, they're on vacation, and what are they doing? They're not being stressed all the time. They're in a different mindset. So does that play a role in the perhaps subsequent, like, feelings that they might have upon eating gluten if they're in a different mental state? Like, has there been any research on
Potentially.
that?
No, not that I'm familiar with. So I do think we have a you know the amount of gluten and the type of gluten that we're exposed to is probably different here than in Europe. I would agree with that, and I think, you know I'm I have to practice what I preach. So like I am very gluten light. If I can choose gluten free, I typically do. Um, that being said, if I
Same.
can't, I'm not stressed about it. I don't have significant bloating issues or GI issues. Um, but some people do. So, if
Yeah.
you've noticed that, then obviously avoiding it is reasonable. But you are 100% correct. Like the mind body effect is very significant as well. So perhaps there is an association with lack of stress, greater enjoyment, decreased, work related responsibility, how that impacts our mood state, and then how our gut functions. Like the mind body connection is absolutely real.
Yeah.
And so, perhaps there's something there. I'm not familiar with any study that's looked at like just general stress levels and quality of life associated with food intake.
Hmm.
I think it'd be a difficult one to study, and ultimately, like,
Yeah.
if you follow the money, and especially in research, like most studies tend to have some
Right.
sort of proprietary
Yep.
funding source. So I don't know if that will get done anytime soon. But ultimately, there's absolutely a consideration associated with your mental state, stress state, and how your body
Yeah.
responds, from an inflammation standpoint. So
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I love that the foods that you mentioned also promote strong gut health, right? So I'm assuming
yeah,
there's a connection between people who suffer from what we can call increased intestinal permeability, right? Or leaky gut, and then an increase in
totally.
inflammatory markers. Have you seen that?
Uh, yeah, I think so. I think the CRP metrics and some of the other sedentary markers, you know, typically people with those GI situations tend to have higher inflammatory profiles. So it's difficult to say, but
Mhm.
typically if they're having an acute inflammatory response or an acute episode, we typically see those inflammatory markers going up as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you touched on foods to avoid. What food should we be consuming if we want to decrease our inflammation? And is there a general diet, right? Like again, we hear all these different, there's diet wars out there, carnivore, plant-based, Mediterranean. Recognizing that everyone is different, right? We have to have an
Yeah.
individual personalized approach. What is like the one that you think most people or would lend like the most beneficial to a majority of the population?
Yeah, that's a great question. For all those listening to this podcast, if you're looking for another podcast that would be very beneficial from a nutrition standpoint, Huberman and Dr. Lane Norton
Yep.
recently recorded one, and Lane Norton's a guru in all things nutrition. So,
Yeah.
uh, like, absolutely listen to it. It's 4 hours, so carve out some time or listen on a 1.2 speed. Um, but one of his points, which is consistent with how I feel, is like the best plan is the one that you can stick with. So the way I approach it is if I was to classify like how people should eat, I would say it's like more Mediterranean. So a lot of vegetables, whole fruits, healthy oils, high quality protein, healthy fats. Um, that's I don't eat a ton of animal protein for some personal reasons, and some because I don't think we produce super high quality animal protein in this country. So that's just my preference. But again, that's like totally me, totally personal. I recently started introducing, and I have no tie to them, like Maui Nui venison, just because it's 100% grass fed, it's wild caught. Like, and I had a good friend, Dr. Andy Galpin, sent me like 30 pounds of venison. So like I just started like, I got to start eating this, or it's going to take up too much space. So it's not a great reason why I started, other than I just had it, and it seems to work for me in terms of a good protein source. I think the biggest thing that we can improve from an overall diet standpoint, regardless of what you would classify as your diet, fiber. We do not get enough fiber in our diet. Most of our food is stripped of fiber because it prolongs the shelf life. Part of what fiber does is it causes moisture to be retained in the substance of whatever food source it is, and the more moisture, the higher likelihood it's going to spoil faster. So we've taken fiber out to prolong shelf life. from an overall metabolic health standpoint, gut health standpoint, microbiome standpoint, cholesterol standpoint, like fiber is increasingly important.
Yeah.
And the current recommendation is like 35 to 40 grams per day, last I checked. If you actually look at how much fiber is in most of the foods we eat, it is not a lot. And I have found that most people, from an inflammation standpoint, gut health standpoint, and just general metabolic health standpoint, blood sugar
Yeah.
control, cholesterol, if you can get enough fiber in your diet, many of the things that bother many people tend to be attenuated. They tend to be reduced. So, if I was to have to pick a diet, I'd say more Mediterranean tends to work because it's pretty diverse, emphasizing more whole foods,
Yeah.
plants, high quality fats, high quality protein. The grains aren't a massive portion, part of that, other than quinoa and things like that. But fiber, 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 fiber. I cannot tell you how many people we work with that just once they increase their fiber intake, whether that's through natural foods or potentially adding like a psyllium supplement,
Yep.
tend to have better GI function, less inflammation, less GI
Yeah.
irritability. Their cholesterol levels tend to improve.
Yeah.
So fiber's a big one.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I am curious, have you ever done one of those DNA report tests like from MaxGen? I don't know if you're familiar with that company. I mean, there's a ton out there, but basically they get back to you with this report. I think it's like a saliva test, or maybe it's a blood prick test, but they basically come back to you and they say, based on your genetics, this is what your body like tolerates well and doesn't tolerate well. And for me, it came back that my body doesn't process saturated fats all that well. And the
Mm,
recommendation was to really try to avoid foods rich in saturated fats, which was really interesting because then I looked at my blood work recently and I noticed that my ApoB was higher than it should be for a 29-year-old
mm,
old
mm,
female who, again, exercises a lot and eats relatively clean. So I'm doing a little bit of an experiment now where I'm really reducing my meat intake over the
mm.
next 2 or 3 months to have my ApoB retested. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting now. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Matt Dawson. He co founded a company called Wild Health. I spoke with him last week, but we were talking about precision medicine, right? And how, like, all of these insights really do determine, right? Like, what diet you should pursue or, different lifestyle interventions. So, what are your thoughts on, like, the future of precision medicine when it comes to, interventions to help mitigate inflammation?
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting. So, like the way we talk about it here with Monarch is this idea of like precision elegance. So, like precision meaning using the new technologies that we have, but also not deviating from like the foundational components that we know are
Right.
associated with high quality health. So, you know, epigenetic testing, DNA testing, specific targeted supplements for individuals, like all very exciting. Food sensitivity testing is, been around for a while. I still think there's
Right.
a ways to go in terms of the applicability and usability. So I'm not opposed to any new technology. I'm always willing to learn and see what we can do in terms of the medical community and the advancement of how we can help people. Um, so yeah, I'm not opposed to new things coming out, and we'll use things that we think will provide a significant impact, sustainable impact on our patients and members. I think for me, what I have found has been most consistent is people tend to get caught up in like the new stuff, the shiny stuff that potentially can provide a hack, so to speak, so that they don't have to you know be adherent to the simple things that we know are going to help people live a long life, right? Like,
Yeah.
are you getting enough sleep? Do you have a good sleep routine? Are you moving your body enough? Are you resistance training? Are you drinking enough water? Are you eating a high quality diet? Are you getting enough calories? Are you getting enough protein? Are you, minimizing sources of inflammation that we know that we can reduce, whether it's physical, mental, emotional? Like, I again, like we're starting Monarch Mind, which is our mental health component. So we're doing neurofeedback with patients. They get a brain scan. We have a
Wow.
neuroscience institute that comes in and looks at just basic cognitive performance. Like, is your brain shifting into the the wavelength state that's required to do certain things? Does it get stuck there? Is it able to have, mobility
Wow.
and flexibility so that when we need to be resting, our brain can also be resting? So I think there's other things that, from a day-to-day standpoint, we have 500 something members that come in 2 to 3 times a week. And, even with all this new technology, I have still found that most people have poor sleep routine, have a hard time sticking with a diet. They're not exercising or moving their body enough. They're not drinking enough water. So, to kind of like summarize my point, and Peter Attia actually said this on his most recent podcast with Huberman, which is like, when you're thinking about health, and he used the analogy of like the Titanic, the problem with the Titanic, it was headed straight for an iceberg. And that heading and direction of the boat was people's sleep, hydration, movement,
Mm-hmm.
and just basic metabolic health.
Yeah.
All the other stuff, the supplements, the interventions, the new testings, the potential longevity drugs, those are equivalent to like, what was the last meal on the Titanic? Like, did that really impact where the boat was
Right.
going? No. So until we get those foundational elements really dialed in, I think a lot of these new things are interesting and could potentially be beneficial, but I do not know if they will overcome those
The
daily
basics.
decisions. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like daily decisions that people are going to make or not make. And I've, from what I've seen from thousands and thousands of, data points here over 5 years, is like most people have a very hard time sticking with a very basic foundational, health program. And if you, use blue zone populations as a
Mm-hmm.
model, like they're not, to my knowledge, using a lot of these,
Advanced
newer
technologies.
interventions. They're just like,
Yeah.
they get good sleep, they get outside, they get sunlight, they have strong communities, they eat primarily, whole foods,
Yep.
plant-based, they exercise regularly. So like that's
Yeah.
where I'm in a world where we're continuing and rapidly advancing in terms of our technological development, which is great and I think needs to happen. I still feel strongly we have, for most people, um, we're yet to have found ways that we can get people to do those simple things consistently.
Yeah, no, I
So,
couldn't agree more. Dr. Dawson, too. I mean, I was like, of all the patients that you've seen in your lifetime, what is one intervention that everyone could use more of? And he said human interaction,
totally,
right? And
totally.
I mean, I forget, I mean, I'm always listening to podcasts. And one this morning, they basically said there was a recent study done that basically said community is like 2 to 3 times more important than nutrition and dietary interventions when it comes to longevity, which at
Yeah.
first I was like, wow, that's crazy. But then you actually look at it and it's like, it's really not that crazy, right? Just,
No, they may have been referring to the Harvard happiness study, which looked at people about over about 80 years of time, and their
yeah, that was a good
takeaway
one.
was essentially the quality of our connections with other humans is probably the most important factor in terms of our,
Right.
longevity and quality of life. So,
Yeah.
again, like the reason we created Monarch the way that we did and made it, a smaller club environment, is because I'll be honest, like part of the reason why I think we're successful is our members just love coming in and working with the training
Right.
team and the physio team and the medical team. And we develop relationships with people because we see them on a regular basis and we get to know them as human beings. Like, what are they interested in? What's happening in their life? What's
Yeah.
happening with their kids? What's happening with their family? And there's studies in the cancer space where like when people are going through cancer treatment, like if you have a strong emotional support network, people tend to do better. And if you don't,
Yep.
the outcomes tend to be worse. And like treatment's the same, surgery, radiation, chemo, but the outcomes are different. And I think we have to pay closer attention to the quality of community and connection that we have because
Yeah.
we are communal beings. We're meant to be in packs.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I feel like too, I mean, we're still coming out of COVID, but now recently, I think over the past like 6 months or so, you see all these running clubs popping up. I actually just joined one in Greenville. It started back in
Nice.
February, but it's insane. There's about 300 people, all 20s and 30s that just show up to run like 3 miles. So I
Yeah.
started going, and to me, I mean, it was beautiful just to see like people show up wanting connection and doing it in a healthy way, right? Instead of going to a bar, like let's go for a 3 mile run. So we're seeing more of that, and it's really really great.
Yeah, totally. It's I see memes on Instagram all the time that like the next hinge and the next Raya is
Yeah.
just like join a running club.
Yep. People are sick of the apps. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
so funny. Um, what else did I want to touch on? Oh, so going back, you mentioned supplements. So, I mean, I'm of the opinion that ideally most of like your nutrients and the things we need should be derived from food, right? But I think there certainly are some situations where supplements might be necessary. First of all, aside from inflammation, are there any like supplements that you think everyone, or I won't say everyone, but a majority of folks should be including in their diet, like magnesium or a probiotic?
Yeah, I mean, the ones that we talk about that are, I think most important and most reasonable for, the majority of people, I kind of break it down to like my top three, which is vitamin D, because
Yeah.
most people tend to be low in vitamin D. Um, Protein and creatine. I just don't think people get enough protein. And we're learning more and more about creatine, especially in aging populations, and its impact on maintaining lean muscle mass and also its
Right.
improvement in cognitive function.
Cognitive.
So, yeah. So I think, in a world where there's more studies coming out about the poor quality control in terms of like, are you actually getting the dose in your supplement that's on the label? Are we absorbing it well? Is it making it through our liver via the first pass effect? Especially
Mm,
with orally administered, capsules, tablets, the absorption and the actual bioavailability. Like most people aren't going to do studies on like if I take 500 milligrams of vitamin C, like how much actually gets into my system, like they would with an FDA approved medication. I
right.
think I think protein, creatine, vitamin D are probably the most common three that I think long term we know have beneficial impact, especially on longevity,
Yeah.
because most people don't get enough protein. Most people are low in vitamin D. We know creatine is beneficial for the things I previously mentioned. You could probably argue fiber, especially if people have a hard time getting enough fiber in their diet, adding some sort of like, psyllium compound, especially if it's a powder, it can be absorbed in water, is
Yeah.
usually a good way to get that. So that's typically where I'm like, these are the supplements that we routinely recommend. Beyond that, there's some other things that we use on occasion, and the best way to know is it working or not is like, are you taking it, and then what's our KPI, what's our performance indicator that we're trying to follow? Is it decreasing A1C? Is it improving cholesterol? Whatever
Right.
that looks like, and then just get your blood tested. And if you're taking things consistently and they're not, you know, achieving the outcome that's desired, we either need to change up our approach, change the supplement, get it from a different provider, or potentially it's just not going to work for us, and we have to rethink our approach. So that's typically
Yeah.
how we do it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I just started supplementing with creatine, I want to say a month or two ago, post conversation with JJ Virgin, who speaks so highly of it. And I've noticed such a change in my energy levels, like just working out. And then I read up recently about the cognitive benefits of that, and I thought it was really, really interesting.
Yeah, very
Um,
interesting.
yeah, what about turmeric and like omega-3 fatty acids?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think from a heart health standpoint, from an inflammation standpoint, there's plenty of data. When I was a fellow, there's a small study at Mayo Clinic that was being done looking at arthritis and like a proprietary ingredient, and turmeric actually outperformed the proprietary anti-inflammatory ingredient. It was just super interesting because the response was like, well, turmeric's difficult to regulate, and so we're
Yeah.
not really thinking much about it. I think the omega threes, the fish oils, the impact on heart health, brain health, incredibly important. Again, quality is a huge issue, and sadly, the nutraceutical industry is highly unregulated. So
Yeah.
the quality of the fish oil you get, it's hard. It's harder to find high quality supplements. But again, like if you're going to try a supplement for anything, like you need to monitor to see if it's working, because like why spend the money or potentially expose yourself to something that could theoretically be harmful for a long period of time if it's not actually leading to the outcome that you're hoping for.
Right.
So again, like if you're going to try something, God bless, as long as it's reasonable and there's data to support it. But ultimately, you want to follow up and make sure, like, is it actually working?
Right. And also too, I mean, to know about like sometimes things have to be paired in order to be better absorbed, right? Like D3 and K2 or turmeric and black pepper. I like recently, is that, would you agree with that? Like there's certain things that
Yeah,
have
I
to be
think
paired or not.
there's, yeah, I think so. And again, like, I think there's other factors that have to be considered in terms of like, when are you taking it? What are you taking it with? Is it supposed to be with food? Is it supposed to be fasted? the absorbability, what actually gets through your liver, depending
Yeah.
on other factors. If your cytochrome P system is elevated because you had a cocktail the night before, like, is that going to
Yeah.
impact the bioavailability? So I think there's a lot of other factors, which is where, like, you know, we come back and we say all the time with Monarch, like, supplements are meant to supplement your
Yeah.
lifestyle. So, again, like, if you're hoping that supplements are going to overcome sleep deprivation, dehydration, poor diet or alcohol intake, excessive alcohol intake, lack of exercise, inability to tolerate life stresses, work stresses, family stresses, like, I'm not aware of many supplements that are going to overcome all those things, especially if you're hitting all of them.
Yeah.
So I place less emphasis on supplements and more on the daily lifestyle choices that we make or don't make.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking of lifestyle choices, and you mentioned fasted state before, what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on fasting? So again, this is an area where there's a lot of controversy, and I don't know, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. And let's assume like this is fasting for an otherwise healthy young individual who doesn't have any other health issues.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of data um, on the fasting world in terms of calorie control. Like, if people are
Hmm.
struggling with weight management, intermittent fasting may be helpful to literally just decrease the amount of calories they consume and help control body fat, potentially improve insulin sensitivity, reduce risk for metabolic disease. Um, from a longevity standpoint, in mouse studies, there's some evidence that it may be, longevity promoting. There's others where it doesn't seem to have an impact. Um, I find that most people, when they fast, like, biologically, it's better for us to eat more of our calories earlier in the day versus stacking them late, because if we're not digesting them, it can impact our sleep quality just based on, like, thermogenesis and core body temperature.
Yeah.
So I think from a fasting standpoint, if it helps people be consistent, make sure they're not overeating or over consuming, and pay a little bit closer attention to what they put in their body, I'm absolutely not opposed. But again, like, if it's going to impact getting enough protein, getting enough fiber, getting enough calories in general, um, yeah, I mean, I think you have to consider that as well, because if you're losing lean muscle mass, or if you're losing strength, because you're not getting enough calories and protein, I think that's a problem as well. And I think the intermittent fasting alone is probably not going to make a huge deal.
Yeah. What about longer fasts, like water, like 24 to 48-hour water fasts? And again, I mean, people talk about all the benefits of autophagy, which we know you can also derive from things like exercise. But yeah, what are your thoughts on longer fasts and even like the fasting mimicking diet? I've tried Prolon in the past before. I mean,
Yeah,
they say there's a lot of clinical trials and research behind that, but I don't know. What's your take?
I I don't know enough about them because I haven't studied them enough in depth, so it's hard for me to provide, like, a true answer. Um, again, for some people, subjectively, it seems to help in terms of the goals they're trying to achieve, reducing inflammation or improving cognitive performance, reducing brain fog, potentially from a weight standpoint, like jump starting their metabolism.
Hmm.
Um, but again, like, what I'm thinking about based on what we see is, like, what are things that people can do consistently for the rest of their life,
Yeah.
that will help promote longevity, and those things may be beneficial intermittently, but ultimately it's, like, not something that you're going to do the rest of your life. And I am
Right.
finding in the general population, like, people have a very hard time sticking with, like, the very simple things. So I tend
Yeah.
not to complicate things, because then people tend to either fail or get discouraged or get confused. So we try to keep it a little bit more simple.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And when I was checking out the Monarch website earlier, I saw that you offer different interventions or hormetic stressors, you can call them, like sauna
Yeah,
therapy and cold
totally.
plunges.
Yep.
What lifestyle interventions, and I mean, I'm assuming those are two of them, are great
Yeah.
for reducing inflammation?
Yeah. Again, I think sauna and cold are probably the oldest and most well studied. Contrast
Yeah.
therapy, the infrared sauna has plenty of data supporting its benefit, reducing inflammation, detox. Cold exposure, same thing. Also, growth hormone production. Cold exposure is great for your mood state. There's a really good
Yeah.
book called A Dose, Dopamine Nation, all about just like our obsession and with like quick hits of dopamine. And one of the things they talk
Mhm.
about is just literal cold exposure and its impact on our mental health and mental state, its impact on our adrenal function and resilience. So those are the ones that we've included because I think they have the most evidence to support them and also like the easiest to use and build into your daily practice.
Yeah.
Um, we use a lot of modalities like the Therabody pneumatic sequential compression boots just to like, help people after they're done moving, like flush their lymphatic system,
Yeah.
move any damage or debris secondary to, movement or lifting, back to their, lymphatic system, to their core, to, which can eventually be filtered out. So versus just like exercising and going sitting the rest of the day at the desk, like what
Right.
can we do to help with fluid movement for elimination, I think are important. But again, like changing temperature also does that because it's impacting vasodilation, vasoconstriction, fluid movement.
Yeah.
So those are the ones that we use most commonly because again, like there's data to support their utilization, and they're also relatively easy to implement into your daily routine.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on PEMF therapy?
I just don't know. I'm familiar with its efficacy. I haven't done enough of a deep dive into um, how it functions, especially in terms of the minimizing inflammation aspect.
Yeah.
So I'm still kind of a novice in there. We're thinking about integrating it as we move forward. Um, One of the things we're probably going to implement is hyperbaric oxygen therapy,
I was just going to
just
ask
because
you. Yeah.
there's a lot of evidence supporting that treatment, especially for people with concussion, mild traumatic brain injury,
Yeah.
tissue healing, post operatively. So
Right.
my considering what I know and us trying to implement things that people can use on a regular basis that also have evidence to support them, um, PEMF is on our radar. I just don't know a ton of as much about it and how it can be integrated um,
Yeah.
in an effective way.
Yeah, I love that you're considering hyperbaric. I actually experienced my first two legitimate, like medical grade hyperbaric sessions 3 or so months ago. And it was a really interesting experience. And I wish it was available a decade or so ago when I had some pretty severe concussions because I knew about it at the time. And obviously now more research is coming out about the benefits of using it following concussions to help mitigate, post concussion symptoms. But
Totally.
um, but at the time, I mean, I like after my concussion, I was calling all these locations and I'm like, is there any way I could come sit and use your hyperbaric chamber? And they were like, no, it's just for burn patients. And
Mm,
there's a lot of research too now. So I don't know if you know, my mom's been dealing with stage 4 breast cancer for the past 6 years. And
sorry.
she's the reason I started WellnStrong, but I'm a huge enthusiast when it comes to trying different integrative modalities and hyperbaric
Yeah.
oxygen. Again, there's a lot of literature on that, even for cancer. So to
Totally.
be able to access that, right, for someone
Yeah.
other than a burn patient would be really, really incredible. So that's really exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's my opinion as well. And so again, like what we are trying to do is offer a space and a system and a program that allows people to have access to these things and be able to make it part of their
Yeah.
almost daily routine. Because again, like if you can do the simple things consistently over a long period of time, it's just principles of compounding. Like those continuous positive inputs will
Right.
exponentially improve your outcomes, or potentially the opposite way if you're not doing them. And I think unfortunately most people experience the downward
Yeah.
curve versus the upward mobility.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And last thing too, Dr. Greene, I want you to touch on is, I mean, with these hormetic stressors, like the whole concept is that it's a short-term stressor that improves
Yeah.
our resilience, thereby helping us
Yep.
long-term. How does
Totally.
that work? Like, what is that process?
Yeah. So interestingly, like I learned a while back that homeopathy was one of the primary forms of medicine that was used in the United States until we pivoted
I
more to like allopathic.
I love homeopathy. If you look in my cabinet right now,
Yeah.
80% of it is just homeopathic remedies.
Yeah. And to be very generic, because I'm not an expert, but I learned about it in my integrative fellowship briefly, is like it's like treats like. So the
Yeah.
long and short is if you can give yourself a little bit of a highly diluted stressor, whatever you're trying to treat. The human body is meant to adapt. It's meant to experience stress, and then it's designed to figure out like, okay, like that caused this outcome. How can we fortify our response to allow us to be stronger in the future? That's how our
Right.
immune system adapts as we're kids. We're meant to get sick. We're meant to get exposed to things so our immune system can learn how to tolerate those stresses. The whole point of
Yeah.
exercise is a stress. You stress yourself, you create a little bit of damage, you recover, and you come back stronger. So I'm absolutely in alignment that if you can, subject yourself to an appropriate dose of these hormetic stressors, some people, even with alcohol, they think like a little bit of alcohol is like a hermetic stressor. Like that's a
Interesting.
different conversation. Because I think,
Yeah.
what we consider a little bit is like way more exposure in terms of like volume and frequency. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's how the human body's meant to function. We are exposed, may cause a little damage. Hopefully, if we treat ourselves well, we can adapt, recover, and then the next time we experience that, we're able to
Right.
tolerate it. Like that's how we function as human beings. So,
Yeah.
yeah. However, you can do that. I think again, like as I mentioned early on in the podcast, like we can absolutely overdo it in terms of anything, like how much we exercise, how much time we spend in sauna and cold, like how much we stress ourselves in terms of fasting and changing our metabolic um, inputs. Like you can do too much of anything, and it can end up being negatively impactful based on dose response. So yeah, I'm all about stressing ourselves, however you want to do that. Ultimately, remembering like you know there's a balance that we need. There's a harmony that we need to seek and
Yeah.
achieve. Hopefully,
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. I can't believe we're almost coming up on the hour. There's still so much I want to talk to you about, so I'll have to have you back on. But I do want to touch
sounds
on
good.
Monarch. So I understand that right now your two locations are in California, but for
That's
listeners
correct.
there, how does that work? How does the process work to sign up? I know you're building another one right now or looking to create another
Yeah,
one in Miami.
yeah. So we've got West Hollywood, we've got Brentwood. We're opening Playa Vista end of this year, which is just south of where we're at in LA. I think it's still technically considered LA. Then we're opening Miami, and we have a couple more after that. What we've created is a one-stop shop. So it's unlimited medical, personal training, physical therapy, nutrition. Plus, we have all the other recovery modalities, mental health, and neurofeedback, as I mentioned. And then it's community. Each club has a set number of members that we will bring in because we want people to be, part of a community and get to know other staff, members, everything like that. Every member gets quarterly assessment, blood work, body composition. We do strength testing so that we can, monitor those metrics associated with maintaining not only lean muscle mass, but also power. We do VO2 max or sub max testing because we don't have like a proper metabolic cart, but we're collecting data every quarter to help people understand like what's working to help them achieve whatever their goals are. And it could be anything. Sometimes it's aesthetic, sometimes it's body composition, sometimes it's, overcoming an injury. But we felt as long as you had unlimited access to movement, medicine, physical therapy, nutrition, as well as a community around you that you enjoyed, immersing yourself in, we would probably
Yeah.
appreciate the outcomes that we were trying to achieve to like help humans be human, to help them live a high quality life, pursue their passion, maintain their joy. We just happen to have created these facilities that are also high end. They have world class amenities. My business partners come from the restaurant and hospitality world, so they're all about environment
It's
and
awesome.
ambiance, and people like nice things, and so we've kind of created this model that we can continue to grow and expand, open up more clubs. Your program is shared amongst our entire network, so you're not tied to a trainer or a physical therapist. Like you can go to any club anywhere and continue to
Wow.
progress along your program, which is one of those areas of opportunity. I was just like, all right, like I travel a decent amount. And when I travel, I need
Yeah.
to figure out where can I go to a gym? Where do they have a Whole
Right?
Foods? Like where can I get my smoothie? I'm like, I'll do
Yeah.
that because it's part of my lifestyle. Most people don't. And so we wanted to eliminate the barriers that allowed or prevented people from achieving that high quality health. And at the end of the day, like right now, full disclosure, we are offering you an opportunity to achieve the best quality version of yourself, whatever that looks like. But it's still tough because it requires an investment in both money and time. And we're still not quite at the point where I've got a couple of things up my sleeve where I think we'll be able to solve this. But right now in healthcare, the more money you spend, the healthier you get. You get no discount on your insurance. It still gets more and more expensive. And
Yeah.
one of the areas that we're working on solving is like, how can we show, whether it's insurance providers, companies, corporations, or whatever, that by being a Monarch member will improve someone's quality of life, reduce their
Yeah.
risk, reduce their chronic disease risk, decrease their costs to themselves and whoever's providing their benefits long term. And I think if we can nail that, we will become the preeminent health and wellness model in the United States and potentially the world. It's very simple what we're doing, but it's not free. Like, you have to invest time, you have to invest money, and we wanted to
Right.
make it something where it's not we're not inexpensive, but all things considered, our value is enormous for what people get versus what
Yeah.
they're spending often in aggregate, but in multiple different places that are not communicating. So we just wanted to make it super simple and say, hey, as long as you show up and you listen, you'll do pretty well.
That's awesome. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'm sure once, I mean, you have that research and, those findings to share with those providers, I mean, the data will speak for itself, right, in terms of incentivizing them. But yeah, that's super awesome. Again, I'm really excited for your Florida location. I will drive to it. But
Yeah,
you definitely have to
awesome.
get one in Greenville. And when you do, I'll be one of your
Yeah,
first members. Um,
sounds good.
awesome, Dr. Greene. Well, where can listeners find you?
Yeah. So easiest for me is Instagram. It's Dr. underscore Greene with an E at the end underscore DO, Dr. underscore Greene underscore DO. Or, if you want to share my email in your show notes, I can share that with you. And if people want to reach out, I can't guarantee that I can help, but potentially I can provide, a push in the right direction if I can't help or I don't know someone who can. So.
That would be great. No, I'll definitely be including the links to those. And my last question for you is, what does being well and strong mean to you?
It's a great question. I think it's something that is a driving force behind what we do with Monarch, which is, being well and strong means you get to do what you do, you get to do what you want when you want to do it. And ultimately, I think that's freedom. Like, one of the things we talk about is health equals freedom. If you're well, if you're strong, you're not inhibited by anything and you get to live the life that you choose to live. And sadly, many people, as they get older, start to lose the ability, lose freedoms to continue to enjoy things that bring them purpose, bring them, allow them to maintain a life of passion and purpose. And that to me is one of the saddest things that can happen to anyone is continuing to be alive but not being able to participate. So if you can
Yeah.
maintain your wellness and if you can maintain your strength, both physically, mentally, and then also emotionally, there's really no reason you will not be able to live the best quality of life you could possibly live.
Yeah. Nailed it. Couldn't agree more. Well, Dr. Greene, this was such an awesome conversation. I'm really excited to share with listeners. And yeah, I mean, we still have so much to talk about. So I definitely will be having you back on again at some point.
Awesome. I look forward to it. Thank you for having me.